Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Globe webinar series on the future of global governance. I'm Carrie Otterburn, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Today, we are joined by Julia Kreienkamp and Tom Pegram to discuss their new book, Global Climate Governance, co-authored with David Coen and published this year by Cambridge University Press. Julia Kreienkamp is a researcher at the University College London Global Governance Institute, where she also works on the GLOBE project. Her work focuses on the global governance of human rights, health, and climate change, particularly with regard to the changing landscape for state and non-state climate action under the 2015 Paris Agreement. Tom Pegram is an associate professor of global governance at the UCL Department of Political Science and deputy director of the UCL Global Governance Institute. Tom's research interests include the theoretical and empirical study of world politics, global governance, and complex system dynamics, with particular expertise on the UN climate change and human rights regimes. Also joining us today as discussant is Professor Katja Biedenkop. Katja is Associate Professor of Sustainability Politics at Leuven International European Studies, LINES, and KU Leuven. She heads the Sustainable Futures Research Group within LINES. Her academic research focuses on the external effects of European Union environmental and climate policy, US climate and environmental policy, climate diplomacy, and polycentric carbon pricing policy. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation by Julia and Tom of about 25 minutes. Then Katja will start off the discussion by offering some reflections and asking a few questions, and Julia and Tom will have an opportunity to respond. Then we'll turn to questions from you, the audience. Please send questions to me throughout the webinar by using the webinar chat box function at the bottom of the webinar window. I will collect your questions to share with the speakers following the presentations. Before we begin, just a few quick words about the GLOBE project. Funded by the European Commission's Horizon 2020 program, GLOBE seeks to understand the constraints and opportunities for the European Union in promoting its interests and values through global governance, with specific attention to 4 key areas: trade and development, security and migration, climate change, and global finance. The 3.5-year project aims to identify the major roadblocks to effective and coherent global governance by multiple stakeholders in a multipolar world, as well as to look ahead to 2030 and 2050 to equip policymakers with the tools they will need to deal with future challenges. On behalf of the GLOBE project, I would like to thank Julia, Tom, and Katja for joining us today. And now it is my great pleasure to turn the floor over to Julia. You have the floor.
Great. Can you all hear me? Yes. Thank you. Thanks very much, Kari. Great to be here today, and thanks to everyone who's joining us today. I will start the presentation with a quick reflection on problem definition, because I think there is now wide agreement that climate change is a defining issue, and maybe the defining issue of our century, and a really pressing concern for global governance. But there is still some disagreement about what kind of problem climate change exactly is and what kind of governance it requires at what level of intervention. So in many ways, of course, climate change is a quintessential global challenge, sometimes portrayed as a planetary scale tragedy of the commons. And this is because in terms of the impacts of global warming, it is essentially irrelevant where and by whom greenhouse gas emissions are produced or avoided. So for states, the costs and benefits of reducing emissions are not directly linked. And this in turn means that there are strong incentives to free ride, to lean back and let others do the hard work. So from this perspective, climate change is primarily a problem of collective action and large-scale market failure. And to avoid it, we really need, above all, strong and robust global frameworks to make sure that states cooperate and play their part. However, there's also increasing recognition that the problem of climate change is even more complex than that. So not only do we have these misaligned cooperation incentives on the global level, but really most of our socio-economic systems have historically evolved to be dependent on fossil fuels and on emissions increasing practices. And because all of these systems are deeply interlinked and also have given rise to particular power structures and vested interests, it's very difficult to break this dependency on one level only. So even if you're really committed as a single country, business, city, or individual, it's very hard to dramatically slash your emissions unless there's also wider change in the systems that you're embedded in. And when I say systems, I really mean everything from energy infrastructures to global value chains to financial flows, but also value systems and behaviors. So from this perspective, climate change can best be understood as a multi-level, multi-actor problem rather than just a cooperation game between states. And importantly, climate change is also a multi-dimensional problem. So it's not just about emissions and about the really hard challenge of decarbonizing the economy, but it's also about adapting to the negative effects of global warming. It's about protecting natural ecosystems, and it's about answering very difficult questions related to justice and to equity and to sustainable development. And many of these issues play out and are best addressed at the local level, but at the same time, they need global cooperation and the transfer of finance and of knowledge and of other resources. Ultimately, climate change intersects with so many other issue areas that as a problem, it's really difficult to neatly isolate from many other big societal challenges. So all of this is part of the reason why climate change has been called a super wicked problem. And we now need to see systemic change on multiple levels by multiple actors across multiple issues. And crucially, we have to see it very fast. So we are still, as I'm sure you know, still a long way off when it comes to avoiding catastrophic global warming and preparing for its negative effects. And what we do over the next 3 decades really matters. So what does that mean for global governance? I think, first of all, it means that global climate governance is not just about multilateral climate treaties. And as we also hoped to illustrate in the book, we really need to pay attention to different types of actors, different scales and types of governance, as well as the interactions between these scales and between different functional domains. And one key question perhaps is how and if we can combine the rigidity of top-down governance with the flexibility and the innovative capacity of bottom-up governance to address both these cooperation problems and catalyze systemic change. So I have just said that global climate governance is not just about global climate treaties, but of course that is not to say that the intergovernmental level does not matter. And it is significant that we do now have a new climate treaty, namely the 2015 Paris Agreement. And I will spend the next few minutes giving a very brief overview of what the Paris Agreement is and how it's different from previous intergovernmental approaches. So on the global level, when it comes to climate governance, the primary forum is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC. And as a framework convention, the UNFCCC itself does not really lay out many obligations for state parties, but it's more providing a broad goal and an umbrella to negotiate more substantial climate treaties. And the first such treaty that was negotiated is the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, which for the first time enshrines legally binding emission reduction targets, notably only for developed state parties. And it also put in place international structures to enforce compliance and novel market mechanisms to enhance the cost effectiveness of climate action. Now, the Kyoto Protocol did indeed help trigger some important policy changes in participating states, maybe most notably in the European Union. But the model itself did not prove sustainable for various reasons. Above all, it locked in the static division and clear-cut static division between developed and less developed states. And it was therefore politically unacceptable to some countries, and most prominently the United States, which in turn made it more difficult for many other developed states to sign up to the second edition of the Kyoto Protocol. So global emissions kept rising, and notably they kept rising in emerging economies such as China that did not have any obligations under the Kyoto Protocol. And at the same time, many vulnerable countries also grew concerned about this overemphasis on emissions and on mitigation because they realized that the negative impacts of climate change really are here or around the corner. So it became increasingly clear that a more inclusive and a broader regime was needed, but at the same time, there was much opposition to this top-down legally binding structure that was embodied in the Kyoto Protocol, especially given the vast difference between states in terms of capabilities, in terms of vulnerabilities, and also in terms of historical responsibility for climate change. So it was only after a long period of relative gridlock, and I'm jumping over a long and complicated story here, that states finally adopted the 2015 Paris Agreement. And I'm going to very quickly highlight some of the main institutional innovations that it introduced. So in general, compared to Kyoto, the Paris Agreement is more about catalyzing action rather than prescribing it. So it provides this kind of long-term roadmap by enshrining 3 collective goals. And most prominently, this is the commitment to keep temperature rises to well below 2 degrees and ideally 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. There are also 2 goals that refer to adaptation and finance. And I think that is also really important because it reflects this high-level recognition that we need to prepare for a warmer world, and also that money has to be fundamentally redirected to enable the kind of transitions that we need to see. The Paris Agreement also acknowledges that all countries have to contribute to reaching these goals, even though developed countries are still expected to take the lead in this effort. And to ensure participation by what is now virtually all countries, there are no longer legally binding emissions reduction targets. And instead, the Paris Agreement asks states to come back with their own so-called nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, in light of their capabilities, responsibilities, and national circumstances. So in effect, these are voluntary commitments. The Paris Agreement also does not have hard enforcement mechanisms, but it has a couple of procedural frameworks and mechanisms in place to ensure that action taken under the agreement is transparent, and crucially, that ambition is scaled up over time. So every 5 years, all state parties have to participate in something called the global stocktake, which really is a collective reflection exercise with everyone coming together and looking at how far the world has come in terms of implementing the Paris Agreement and how far it still has to go. And following each of these stocktakes, parties are then required to submit updated NDCs that are informed by this collective assessment. And right now we are at this critical moment where state parties have to update their initial commitments, and many have already done so. And then finally, the Paris Agreement provides a broad framework that cannot be utilized just by states, but also by other actors. So we have also seen many cities, businesses, investors, and others align their actions with the Paris Agreement goals and with the Paris Agreement temperature goals. The UNFCCC has also established new platforms to showcase and to encourage such commitments. Okay, so this is my final slide, and it's a figure that very quickly illustrates this underlying logic of the Paris Agreement. So basically, the agreement sets this collective direction of travel on the right. And in terms of mitigation, to stay within the 1.5 degree limit, really we need to arrive at net zero global emissions by mid-century. And to get there, the NDCs, or the national commitments that are on the left, have to be gradually ratcheted up in this stepwise manner. And this is facilitated, at least in theory, by these global level mechanisms on the top. So that includes the transparency framework and the global stocktake, but it's also supported by sub and transnational climate action at the bottom, and pressure from domestic constituencies. So the Paris Agreement has been hailed by some as a really innovative example of global governance. And it has definitely moved the conversation from cutting emissions to undertaking really long-term systemic transformations. But at the moment, of course, it remains a collection of promises, and it remains a collection of insufficient promises. And although we have recently seen this flurry of commitments to net zero in mid-century, emission trajectories really at the moment do not line up with these commitments. And there's also a growing concern that there's an overemphasis on the net part of the zero. So that is opportunities to offset emissions, and too little focus on systemic decarbonization. So ultimately, the effectiveness of the Paris Agreement depends on a massive increase of ambition and, of course, actual implementation. And I think the global mechanisms that the agreement provides, they offer a degree of pressure and peer pressure, but the real accountability holders are at the domestic level. So in other words, the Paris Agreement offers a flexible and inclusive institutional framework, but it is not self-enforcing. And I think we need to see large-scale mobilization on all levels to drive implementation. And I think this is the point where where Tom will take over. So we have to switch slides quickly.
Just sent the presenter change.
Is that working for everyone?
Yes.
Can you see that?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Okay, very good. So I'll now take the baton from Julia. Thanks for the invitation. Nice to be here with you all. So obviously we're trying to compress a lot of information into a short presentation, and we'll do our best. I mean, essentially where I pick up, I guess, is the fact that climate change governance does not begin and end with formal intergovernmental organizations, or indeed the Paris Agreement. In the book, we do try and capture what scholars have referred to as a Cambrian explosion of formal and informal activity at all levels or scales of governance, from the global to the most local. And there's really a number of ways that we might cut and dice a very complex ecosystem. One quite popular way is to differentiate between state, market, and networked actors, all of whom perhaps bring certain logics of action to bear on this climate predicament that we find ourselves in, and the kinds of policies that may be available in terms of responding to the climate emergency. So we document, we go through sort of a survey of these different activities, and we, for instance, highlight the role of the G20 and other informal international organizations. But it's probably within the European Union regional system that we do see the most elaborate climate governance apparatus, and we do go into some depth in the book on that apparatus, and we do try and distill it into a diagram as well, and perhaps we'll get more into that in the Q&A, especially given the expertise of Dr. Biedenkop. Of course, then going down other scales, we have the national governments, we have subnational authorities, which have become particularly prominent in recent years, partly because cities are estimated to account for around 75% of all global CO2 emissions. And of course, also they are particularly vulnerable to the negative effects of global warming. I think it's Miami, which is the most vulnerable coastal city in the world to rising sea levels. And then we move on to a very complex ecosystem of networked actors, transnational actors that sort of crisscross over territorial boundaries, and they're engaged in all kinds of climate governance functions as well. So we see a lot of private regulation. That's a particular focus at Leuven. You know, there's a lot of activity among corporate actors setting their own targets now, setting their own standards in the absence of legally binding obligations, at least binding on them. So we hear a lot about carbon accounting in the news, as well as net zero commitments by big companies, including some in the fossil fuel industry. Now, of course, debate on whether such self-policing can actually work or instead serves mainly as a kind of a greenwashing function remains very much an empirical question, one that we're also looking at in another project. And then importantly, of course, we have civil society actors. We have the mobilization at the grassroots level. We have the youth movements, of course, Greta Thunberg, and we also have sort of more technical expert civil society in play as well. Actors like the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which have sort of taken it upon themselves to press companies to honor the commitments within the Paris Agreement, and they're trying to hold companies to account through transparent reporting metrics on emissions. Quite interesting example of the power of indicators in global governance there. And when it comes to the regime complex, this term made famous by Robert Coen and David Victor, the complex of this multi-level climate change governance apparatus, debate rages on the pros and cons of more or less fragmentation versus centralization of authority. Arguments in favor of decentralized regime arrangements often begin by noting that efforts at centralized regime building have not fared well. Kyoto was never fully operational. The 2009 Copenhagen meeting effectively shut down further negotiations on a legally binding centralized regime. So we could say that since 2009, there's been something of a pragmatic direction, and many scholars would argue that this is actually the right way to approach climate change for a range of reasons, including the fact that the problems of climate change are cut across so many different issue areas. We think of trade, we think of security, health, migration, and as such, this multifaceted problem sort of task environment requires a looser arrangement. Now, as Julia's laid out, the promise of the Paris Agreement lies in its potential in a way to exploit the rapidity of top-down vertical authority, but combine that with the experimentation, the learning, the effectiveness of horizontal, bottom-up, non-state market action. As Julie's emphasized, this promise is yet to be realized. Most glaringly, of course, carbon emissions are yet to peak. I mean, one of the data points which I think most surprised me in the course of doing this research is the fact that over half of all CO2 cumulative emissions since pre-industrial times have taken place since 1990, when I was at primary school, and indeed a couple of years before the first UNFCCC meeting kicked off. And we all know that the later emissions peak, the more difficult it is going to be to stabilize global heating. So perhaps to elaborate a bit more on this kind of the wicked problem aspect, particularly when we turn to the question of implementation of climate policy within domestic jurisdictions. Stephen Bernstein and Matthew Hoffman have a fantastic paper on what they refer to as the fractal nature of the political economy of decarbonization. And in that frame, climate change is many interrelated problems, and these problems are embedded in our wider social and economic systems. They're quite difficult to isolate, to pull apart, difficult because also that they are evolving. They have certain path dependencies, but they also have certain emergent properties, and this often makes it difficult to find a definitive technical or legal fix. And concretely, we are now really in a phase where we see a profound operational shift towards implementation, and part of the objective with the book was to document some of these trends, particularly the formalization, articulation of global or international standards within governance structures at all levels. And one particular trend which we found quite fascinating actually is the early onset proliferation of independent climate advisory bodies, such as the UK Climate Change Committee, which have begun to proliferate throughout the EU and beyond. And it seems that they were not necessarily promoted by UN authorities or even the EU, that this is more a result of transnational horizontal entrepreneurialism by domestic policy actors. So really an interesting dynamic there, and perhaps an effort by domestic policy actors to accelerate climate action through these kinds of bottom-up horizontal channels. And why does this matter so much? Well, it matters because decarbonizing the global economy, which is obviously the target now, will require unparalleled policy coherence at all levels and across all different sectors within the economy. Otherwise, there are real risks, risks that interventions, even if well-meaning, will displace problems rather than resolve them, or perhaps more subtle risks, such as the possibility that good interventions will nevertheless fall short of the radical decarbonisation required to meet the Paris Agreement targets of 1.5 degrees, which is looking challenging. And, you know, this matters. I mean, as earth scientists at UCL like to remind us, their social science peers, it's important to remember that nature bats last. So this is really a crucial decade for climate policy. It's a crucial decade for the UNFCCC process and for this elaborate institutional apparatus which has grown over the last 2-3 decades. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has declared 2021 the year to reconcile humanity with nature. I think that gives us all a sense of the scale of the challenge, which goes far beyond the confines of governance, any specific governance actor or structure. And what we've hoped to convey in this book is a useful overview, a primer of the complex articulation of global to local governance in the climate domain, to give some insight into the scope for really scaling up multi-level intermediation. So where are these kinds of the key actors within these networks? Where are they located? Where is the most potential for accelerating policy implementation to the national level? And under the right conditions, there is evidence that these processes can reinforce, can accelerate the ambition of the Paris Agreement. Domestic constituencies will play a crucial role in pressing governments through the ratcheting mechanism, through the nationally determined contribution mechanism under the Paris Agreement, and also the transparency and domestic accountability mechanisms, including, of course, the courts, will also be crucial. And to end, perhaps just to flag one of the key challenges that is, I think, cropping up a lot in our research currently, and one that we're looking at in some depth, is the problem facing decision makers as radical policy change becomes inevitable and imminent. How do they navigate this policy scenario to ensure a just green transition? So serious climate action, it will imply unprecedented transformation. That transformation is likely to stoke distributive costs, possibly conflict, both at the domestic and the transnational, international level. So it's really crucial that we start to think about how these decarbonisation policies can be made socially inclusive. And this is an area that we're now exploring in follow-up research, and perhaps something that we'll pick up in the Q&A. So I think that's it from me. Thanks a lot. Look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you both, Tom and Julia, for this very concise overview of a lot of information. Now, before we turn to Katja, I will just quickly remind the audience that the Q&A will begin relatively shortly, so feel free to send me your questions through the chat box window. And now over to you, Katja.
Okay, thank you. I will not talk for too long so that we have enough time for the Q&A. Thanks a lot, Julia and Tom, for summarizing your book, and it was a great pleasure reading the whole book. It actually is a very nice summary or introduction of what's happening in global climate governance at the moment and how we got there. So I'm teaching these things, and I was already thinking of whether and how I could use your book in one of the early sessions to make sure that everyone understands what's happening. So thanks a lot for going through the effort of writing the book. Yes, it explains very well the main characteristics of the Paris Agreement, which, as you note, is quite different from the Kyoto Protocol and many of the other older international agreements that we know. And it highlights very well this complexity of global climate governance. So that's one of the really strong points of the book. And the other one is the emphasis on the non-state actors and all the other actors who are also involved. So really demonstrating that global climate governance is much more than the Paris Agreement. And the mapping of this broad range of various different kinds of actors is really well done and is essential for addressing climate change. So that's the other very strong point of the book, and why I think it really provides a good introduction to why this is such a complex problem. So then both of you referred to this problem and the complexity and the regime complex. So the book really provides an extensive discussion of the nature of the problem of climate change. It's a super wicked problem that requires measures in all areas by all actors, and as Tom in the end said, it really requires transformations. And in this regard, you state in the beginning that we need to agree upon the contours of the problem posed by climate change, and that is a challenging task in itself. And you describe quite well why and how this is a collective action problem, a global common good. But that discussion raised the question in my mind to what extent it is actually necessary in a system in which so many different actors adopt different policies tailored to their local context. To what extent is it in this context necessary to agree on what exactly the problem is? So, or is it enough actually to agree on the urgency of addressing climate change, but not necessary on the details? So this is really a discussion or a question that I was wondering when reading that discussion, and you really approach it very well, and you mentioned a number of different authors who develop different concepts. So and the reason why I was wondering that, and why I find this discussion a very important one, is that if you portray climate change as such a daunting challenge and threat, that could then make people feel helpless or paralyzed to then not really act or not knowing what they should do. And for this reason, I find this lens of polycentric governance quite appealing. I guess you know it as well. So basically, I mean, the basic notion is that you don't only see a problem as this global problem, but rather you look at the local motivations, and they can be quite different. So what incentivizes people to act at a local level can be very different from what we would think would be the motivation or what would be the global common good. I mean, the examples, I guess, it can be local air quality, improving standards of living, access to water, all these kinds of things, which can actually make it quite tangible and feasible for people to change and to act. So, and that's just my first open question. And then to some extent, I think, Tom, you also got at that already in the end. So what's the role of the super wicked problem in that whole process? Do we, to what extent is that actually helping us to address climate change, or to what extent do you think do we need to define, or do we actually need to define the problem at the international level, or how does that play out? And then related to that is you refer to the fragmentation literature, and that literature finds it problematic that there are too many organizations and too many places that all duplicate measures, and then that you have quite some redundancy or overlap. And I was just wondering, I'd like to hear your idea on, actually, is that really problematic? Or can such an overlap also be positive? So if one process or activity falls away, you still have another one that can be mutually reinforcing, those kind of things. So, just your ideas on, in this regime complex, is fragmentation, is that always a negative thing, or is that positive? And what are your insights from your research on that? And so I was not going to talk for too long, so I'm not going to use all my comments. Then maybe just two last questions just for you. I just would like to ask you about COP26. You know, you've looked at the history and you've looked at all this problem that we're trying to address with the Paris Agreement. What do you expect from COP26 in Glasgow? How does that fit in the picture? And related to that, what impact do you expect does the Biden administration have on global climate governance? Thank you.
We can directly turn to you, Tom and Julia, to respond. And also, you can continue sending me questions. That's a comment for the audience.
Do you want me to kick off, Julia, or do you want to have a swing at it?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes. Happy to kick off if that's fine with you.
Sure.
Thank you, Katja. That was really useful, and I think you actually touched upon quite a lot of things that we have thought about a little bit more since we finished the book, because we looked a bit more at complexity theory and what we can learn from that. And I think what thinking about climate change as a complex problem implies, and I know complex sounds maybe just as scary as super wicked, and it's basically the same idea, but the idea with problem definition is really about the systems change that we have talked about. And I think what we need kind of on a global and broad level is this broad agreement that transformative system change is needed, and that we need some kind of roadmap to get there. And I think the Paris Agreement it does a good job at giving us this roadmap. But I completely agree that there is this global local tension, and that problems often play out very differently on the national or on the local level, or in particular companies. And we really do need to see very different solutions in different places. And that also means that the particular problem definition will look a little bit different depending on where you are and what you look at. So I think to resolve this tension, we don't need an elaborate definition of climate change as a problem, but more, I guess, a collective commitment to really deep systemic change. And that also relates a little bit to the part that you said about the dauntingness on all of this. And I mean, we definitely feel that as ourselves working on this. It is sometimes quite hard to keep it all in your head, and it's quite hard to be optimistic often. But at the same time, even though complexity sounds very scary, it really means that everyone has a role to play, and that there are many things that we can do on the local level and in our capacity. And something that is maybe not so emphasized in the book is the role of people. And we have just seen, the youth groups suing, like taking governments to court and winning. And these are quite encouraging things that can happen and that can really make an impact. And I'm just going to pick up on the COP26 question maybe. I think COP26, as I said, it's now the critical moment where the NDCs are updated. So it will definitely be about ambition, and we need to see this big sign. It's going to be symbolic hopefully it's going to be symbolic, especially coming out of COVID-19, to say, all right, we're ready to really undertake transformations and make changes. But it's going to be a lot about finance, given that we need new financial commitments, about how we can really support vulnerable and developing states in addressing climate change and adapting to climate change. I think nature will play a role. This is something we've recently looked at. There's more discussions about nature-based solutions. So that is kind of more about finding a shared agenda between the biodiversity regime as well and the climate change regime. And there are some exciting things happening there. And I think that's something the UK as a host is also keen to push. So I think I'm going to stop here and give Tom an opportunity to respond as well.
Yeah, thanks, Julian. Thank you, Katja. Great questions, really interesting area, and something we are thinking a lot about actually in some follow-on projects around, as Julian mentioned, complexity theory. Is it important to agree on the problem? I think we would have to say that my thinking at the moment is that, yes, it is really important. And it probably take a while to lay out why that's the case in the context of the sort of complex theory perspective. But the point you make is very well taken, that there's an issue with climate change being viewed as this overwhelming challenge, this kind of the Timothy Morton idea of the hyper object that no one can get a grip on, and so we have to make this tractable. And that's where the think globally, act locally kind of rhetoric comes in. Of course, the problem is that because people don't seem to have a clear sense of the kind of the indirect consequences of their actions, often we are acting globally and thinking locally. We're just externalizing all of this waste and depletion and accumulation into the environment. So it seems as if there's sort of a basic problem definition that isn't really cutting through when it comes to the general social cultural norms, which might be a little bit off the reservation for this conversation. But more specifically, when it comes to defining the problem, I think the key issue there is that the way we define a problem will also inform the kinds of interventions that we then deploy. So if we're defining the problem focused purely on the output end, shall we say, so CO2, for example, CO2 is a problem, but obviously ultimately it's more of a symptom than a root cause. If we put all the focus on CO2, as we tend to do, that tends to then shift the focus onto, say, carbon capture storage. It shifts the focus onto sort of technology at the output end of the challenge. It shifts attention away from, say, the root cause input within system dynamics. So I'm thinking, of course, of consumerism. I'm thinking, of course, of accumulation, depletion dynamics, massive waste dynamics, and also biodiversity loss and habitat degradation, which ultimately, as we're seeing, the Amazon's now flipped to a net contributor of CO2 due to massive deforestation. So we need to think carefully about how we are defining these problems, because it will impact the way we understand the challenge and the kinds of interventions that need to be deployed. But that's a much bigger conversation, which I'm really interested in having right now, actually, with colleagues. On fragmentation as negative, I think the key point I just say is, we all want innovation, right? But we want innovation that follows healthy evolutionary pathways. And it's not just technological innovation. We need innovation in social terms, in education terms, but we also have this time constraint. We need things to happen within now 8 years, according to the IPCC. And that's often been the role of the state, the top-down command and control function, the moonshot approach to climate change. So innovation is often seen as within the market, but perhaps we need to think a bit more carefully about whether innovation in the climate domain should be necessarily seen as a market opportunity. We need the state to be able to exploit healthy innovation, wherever that comes from, but perhaps we need to ensure that that innovation is not subverted by kind of rentier capitalist dynamics. We need to sort of shift the orientation to a more public good substantive function, as opposed to purely the market provides kind of idea, where market failure often can kick in. And then, of course, we could get into discussion around power dynamics under conditions of fragmentation, but perhaps I'll just leave that there. And on COP26, yeah, it's going to be really interesting. I mean, the UK was seen as a leader on climate change in the early 2000s, 2008 with the Climate Change Act. We've had the government coming out with some very ambitious targets, but for many experts, the government still seems to be treating climate change like a challenge for tomorrow rather than today, and perhaps the same can be said for other governments. And this is a critical year, but business is putting pressure on government. They are signalling they want government action here. Nick Stern remains a prominent voice in that respect. So we're going to see if governments do rally to meet this leadership challenge. Biden may apply some helpful pressure. And I guess the other question is whether the public will really hold government's feet to the fire. So we're going to find out.
Thank you very much to both of you. I'll now turn to questions from the audience. We have quite a number, so we have about 15 minutes, so let's try to get through as many rounds as possible. I'll start off with about 3, and then we can do successive rounds. So first, I'll turn back to what you were just discussing, the climate change conference in November. One audience member is asking how you see the complex multi-level governance interfacing with this conference, and do more actors need to be at that virtual table? And then I have another one that brings back the point you were making before about fragmentation and various initiatives at different levels. What role and responsibility for individual citizens and companies do you see? A couple of audience members brought up some private initiatives and even a smartphone app, such as the CUNCR iGreen smartphone app, as well as other private instruments and citizen movements and corporate initiatives that all aim to assist individuals in reducing carbon footprint or making sustainable consumer choices, among other things. As these are fragmented or unregulated, is there a risk of citizens getting bad advice? Does it slow things down? You were talking about speed being of crucial importance here. Does it preempt other instruments? Or is it such a situation that more the merrier in these types of things, as they have the potential to engage more and more citizens? And then third, let's go into climate justice. What are your thoughts on that, and how might Global South leaders engage on that, and also Global North leaders, if you could give some thoughts on that issue as well. And we'll start there.
Okay, I'll have a go first, and then Julie, you can jump in, pick up what I miss. So yeah, great questions, thank you. So I mean, on the first one, in terms of representation at COP26 and how it relates to the UNFCCC regime, I think Paris has really galvanized a lot of effort to try and open up decision-making processes within the climate domain to multiple voices. There's clearly still a lot of work to be done there, and it is a bit of a challenge, right? I mean, it speaks to fundamental tensions with kind of democratic mechanisms, perhaps outdated democratic mechanisms, and also how we use new technologies to try and arrive at some sort of to try and nuance understanding as to what are the constituencies, what are the interests in play, and how do we actually really move forward as a collective. There are some really interesting initiatives. In fact, one that we came across the other day was a UNDP popular climate vote, which had sort of rolled out across all sorts of different countries to try and collect popular sentiment on the climate challenge, the kinds of policies that would be more or less acceptable to these constituencies. But I hadn't heard of this initiative before it was flagged to me by our colleagues. So there's a lot going on, but it seems as if a lot of it is flying under the radar. So one might also point to, of course, citizen juries, which have been a popular mechanism within the UK to try and pool ideas among the citizenry as to what a just transition to a sort of a green recovery from COVID-19 might look like. And these are all sort of really fascinating prototype examples of where we might go and how we might deploy new social technology for that kind of function. I mean, how it relates back into the COP26 and the UNFCCC, I think that's a great question. It depends who you ask. I mean, some people think that the UNFCCC process is still perhaps a bit anachronistic in the degree to which states still kind of determine the confines of the discussion and who's actually in the room when important decisions are being made, and others are perhaps more optimistic about openings for plural voices to be heard in those spaces. So yeah, on the second question, was so how are we going to move quickly given the time constraint? That's a really important question. It's one I think that speaks a bit to this idea of innovation versus kind of the rapidity of top-down exploitation of state authority to move things forward quickly. But of course, as intimated in the question, we do need experimentation here, because we haven't actually stumbled across the key kind of magic bullet that's going to solve this problem. So I think what we're observing out there at the moment is parallel experimentation occurring in all sorts of different domains, whether state, whether private, whether hybrid, and it's really a question of how do we advance healthy innovation, how do we ensure that experimentation is maintained at a high intensity, and how then do certain actors with the authority and legitimacy to do so then scale up successful looking projects. So I think I'll hand over to Julia for perhaps question 3 and anything else she wishes to add.
Okay. So yeah, on the non-state actors, I mean, you can hear me. Okay. I agree the UNFCCC forum, of course, is very much about states, but I think non-state actors and all of us are really important as accountability holders and putting the pressure on governments on the sides. And I think we've seen that this really makes a difference in terms of the kind of the innovation we're seeing in the individual consumer choices. I think there's a lot of exciting stuff going on. The one danger is, of course, greenwashing initiatives, and I think we need more applications and more support really to help consumers see, you know, what are genuine good climate initiatives and climate friendly products and what are not, because it's really not always that straightforward. And of course, there is also a danger of putting too much emphasis on individual choices and neglecting the really crucial role of states setting the frameworks for these choices to be made. So on the climate justice question, thank you for that. I think climate justice is really an important issue, and I think it will be more and more important as we really see the negative effects of climate change playing out. There is some things happening here on the multilateral level. So loss and damage, for example, has got its own article in the Paris Agreement, which really refers to the kind of impacts of climate change that we cannot mitigate anymore and that we also cannot adapt to, but which kind of relates to justice-related questions. The problem at the moment is that there isn't really much money or support going into this. So it's obviously a very frustrating situation for climate vulnerable countries. I think we're also seeing, and Tom has talked about this, but we're seeing climate justice related questions playing out on the domestic level much more, as we really have to get real about these transitions, and also have to get real about the fact that not everyone is going to win, at least not in the immediate term, from these transitions. So I think participation of people and also of vulnerable communities and those that are often marginalized, including indigenous communities, that will be really important going forward.
I think I'm having a bit of a audio difficulty here. I don't know if you can still hear me. Okay.
Yeah, you're back, yeah.
Okay, great. So I think we actually have, thank you very much for those responses. I think we actually have time for one more round. We'll try to do it quickly since there's not too much time left, but we have some more interesting questions. So first, we have a question asking or mentioning that some academics tend to observe that political concepts and tools need to be revised and perhaps a change of political paradigm, which challenges in particular in democratic countries how we do politics. And there's an initiative of transnational democratic deliberation designed for COP26. Would you agree with this diagnosis, and what do you think of transnational deliberative democracy in this context? Kind of on the opposite side of the spectrum, we have a few questions asking about more of the top-down approach in terms of increasing efficiency and reducing complexity and improving policy coherence at all levels. And so we have one suggestion or asking about the possibility of a sort of all of government, all of multilateralism approach, such as the establishment of something like a Global Resilience Council to provide authoritative and comprehensive leadership for climate action and other global challenges, sort of like the UN Security Council, but for non-military threats. And this is coming from the foundation, the director of the Foundation for Global Governance and Sustainability. And then relatedly, we have a question from an audience member asking about the thoughts on the possibility of UN member states invoking Article 109 on the UN Charter to vote for a 2/3 resolution to effectively address climate governance. And then the third, we have a question from an audience member asking if climate change is really an example of a super wicked problem, since we know fairly well what is causing it and what to do. Is it not just a problem of political will, free riding, and enforcement? So I think that will be this round of questions. I don't think we'll have time for another, but let's see where we go from there.
Julia, do you want to start off on this time?
I think this always takes a while to unmute. These are really good questions and really challenging ones as well. So I'm sorry if my answers are a bit unsatisfactory. I think the question about challenges to democracy is really important, and it's going to be an interesting question of how we see that play out in the near future. I mean, I've already said, I think democracy and participatory justice will actually be really, really important going forward, because otherwise these transformations just won't be sustainable. But I think the biggest challenge to democracy we really have with climate change is this really existential problem that it poses. So it's, you know, might really, I mean, climate change has the potential to disrupt most of the systems that we rely on, including our political systems. And I think we will see much more contestation, political contestation going forward. And as I said, no satisfactory answer to that, but I think it's important that that this contestation is not swept aside, but addressed. And I think that we do have interesting new tools. COVID-19 has also shown that, you know, with digital democracy, maybe there are more avenues of how we could collaborate better and faster in the future. Yeah, so really important question. Sorry if that's a slightly unsatisfactory answer. Also, yeah, very interesting about the idea of the Global Resilience Council. I don't know very much about this initiative, but I agree that resilience will be, I think the idea of being resilient to climate change and many other related risks will have to be, if not, you know, put in a new structure, mainstream much more throughout the multilateral and domestic systems. Maybe just on the question of complexity, I guess us talking about climate change being a complex problem or a super wicked problem is not taking away from the reality that there is also, you know, power structures and really difficult cooperation problems on the global level. So I think we really have both. We have a really difficult cooperation problem, and we have the systemic problem that is underlying it. I will stop here. I think I've forgotten one question, but maybe Tom can pick up here.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Julian. Thank you for the really great questions. I'm really not going to do justice to them right now. This idea that we need kind of a Kuhnian sort of paradigm shift in political concepts and tools to understand the climate challenges it's a great question. You know, and it depends, I guess, how radical you want to be about that. I mean, certainly it does challenge how we do politics if we understand climate change as a truly sort of planetary issue. It brings into play Johan Rockström's idea of planetary boundaries, Kate Raworth's donut economics. You know, essentially we need to expand the aperture of how we understand the way the political system is embedded within other systems, including ultimately Earth systems. And maybe that is a very radical challenge to how we understand and do politics. If you go back to debates in the 1950s, after the UN was established in the shadow of the nuclear bomb, you might be surprised at how radical some of the proposals around global political federalism were at that time. Robert Baratta has a masterly piece of work on that, 2 volumes project on those debates, which were taken very seriously, including by leading politicians in the US. And those debates seem to have sort of just been forgotten. Perhaps it's time that we begin to revive some of those more, shall we say, visionary ideas. But of course, it's a very contentious issue right now in the context of a sort of resurgence of national populism. Some philosophers like John Gray, they welcome a retreat to national borders. They welcome a retreat back to this sort of the small-scale communal politics. But if we really think climate change is a global problem and it requires global action, which I am convinced of, then we need to be more imaginative. But I guess this is the paradox: is that it's a very exciting moment, and we haven't yet fashioned the political response, whether that's in the more conceptual academic or in the more policy political practice realm. And that's the work that's before us. When it comes to the Global Resilience Council, yeah, I echo Julia, sounds very interesting. I guess I think immediately of the work of the UN Disaster Risk Reduction Unit, very fascinating work by that unit, really interesting reports that they issue each year on the global assessments, the Sendai framework. I mean, all of that seems to me like that is prototyping some of the intellectual context that would be required for such a global authority. Of course, that raises questions of authority and legitimacy, and the division of labour across different scales of governance, questions of polycentricity, as Katja has mentioned. And it brings us back to sort of seminal debates, which were always were a bit fuzzy, sort of the James Rosenau ideas of glocal, how do we combine the global and the local in these kinds of hybrid political systems? And then the final question on super wicked problems. Well, I would first refer you to work by Stephen Bernstein and Benjamin K. Shaw and Guy B. Peters, who have done a lot of work on complex wicked problems, super wicked problems. I find it fairly convincing. Is this just an issue of political will, free riding and enforcement? Great question. There's a very interesting new article debate by Acklin and Mildenberger arguing that it's not really a collective action problem, it's more of a distributive cost problem. But frankly, it might be a bigger problem than that. We just don't know yet because we're not really off the starting blocks in some respects. Is this a problem? Is it a predicament that we just have to live with? It's clearly a problem which it's going to be with us for hundreds of years. I mean, we already have, we have exponential glacial ice melt. The seas are going to rise. It's a very interesting moment, I think, to think carefully about that question. And ultimately, this decade is perhaps going to witness us transition towards some kind of carbon realism, where it won't just be progressives who understand the nature of this imperative, but it's going to be a much bigger collective. One hopes a much bigger collective action, much bigger sort of political will in the direction of really grappling with this immense challenge.
Thank you so much. We are indeed out of time, but I think we did cover a lot of ground today. So thank you very much to both of our presenters, Tom and Julia, and also to our discussant, Katja. Before leaving you, I'd like to quickly announce that our Globe webinar series continues next month with a final webinar before the summer break. That is on June 10th with Genevieve LeBaron on combating modern slavery, why labor governance is failing, and what we can do about it. And then the Globe webinar series will be back in September. So do stay tuned, and you can register for our next webinar and see all of the previous ones at globe-project.eu. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon. On behalf of the Globe Project, thank you and goodbye.